The ferry glided silently over the calm water, the fiery hues of the blood-red sunset casting long shadows across the deck. The stillness of the evening was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. James leaned against the cold metal railing of the upper deck, his face shrouded in shadow. His breathing was steady, but his heart hammered in his chest as he peered down through the glass-paneled cabin below. Inside, Lily sat with Brandon, the CEO whose charm and arrogance had captivated more than just the boardroom. Their laughter floated faintly upward, mingling with the soft hum of the ferry's engines. James gripped his phone tightly, the camera lens trained on the scene below. He captured every moment, the shared glances, the clinking of glasses, and the easy way Brandon leaned closer to whisper something that made Lily's eyes sparkle with delight. "I never thought betrayal had a sound," James whispered to himself, his voice barely audible against the breeze. But hearing her laugh with him that night, I knew. This wasn't just a mistake. This was war. He felt the weight of the betrayal pressing on his chest, suffocating him with every second that passed. The woman he had built his life around, the mother of his children, was sitting mere feet away, sharing secrets and smiles with another man. And not just any man. Brandon was everything James despised. Wealthy, self-assured, and smug in his ability to take what he wanted. James's knuckles turned white as he tightened his grip on the phone. He focused the camera, zooming in on Brandon's hand as it brushed against Lily's. For a moment, his thoughts spiraled into rage, imagining himself storming into the cabin and demanding answers. But he held back. The time for confrontation would come, but not tonight. Tonight, he needed proof. Proof that would turn their lies into weapons he could use. The ferry shuddered slightly as it adjusted course, the sound jolting James from his thoughts. He glanced around to ensure no one had noticed him standing there, lurking like a shadow. The deck was empty, save for a few couples taking selfies near the bow. No one paid attention to the man whose world was quietly falling apart. James lowered the phone, his jaw clenched. The pieces of the puzzle had been falling into place for weeks. The late nights, the secretive texts, and now this. He had wanted to believe Lily's excuses, her claims of stress at work or long meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. But the truth was glaring at him now, undeniable and raw. As the ferry approached its destination, James slipped the phone into his pocket and straightened his posture. He inhaled deeply, the salty air stinging his lungs. It wasn't just anger that fueled him, it was resolve. This wasn't just about what Lily had done. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his sense of control, and the life he had worked so hard to build. James turned away from the cabin and began walking toward the exit ramp, his footsteps steady and purposeful. The war had just begun, and James was prepared to play the long game. Brandon and Lily might think they had won tonight, but they had underestimated him. The faint sound of their laughter lingered in his ears as he stepped off the ferry, swallowed by the bustling crowd on the dock. He allowed himself one final glance back at the cabin, his lips curling into a grim smile. They had no idea what was coming. The morning sun streamed through the windows of James's modest suburban home, casting a golden glow on the worn oak floors he had installed himself years ago. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of cinnamon from the pancakes sizzling on the stove. This was their sanctuary, their haven, a home built on years of shared dreams and hard work. But today, it felt like a facade, a hollow shell of the life he thought he knew. James sat at the kitchen table, absently running his fingers over a crack in the wood surface. He had patched that table after a family game night ended in laughter and chaos. His son, Max, now 10, had tipped over the Monopoly board in frustration, while 8-year-old Emily had giggled uncontrollably. Lily had been there too, her laughter ringing out as she wiped tears of joy from her eyes. When did that laughter change? He wondered, his chest tightening. Lily had always been his partner in everything. They had met in college, two broke dreamers who bonded over cheap coffee and endless conversations about their future. She was his anchor, the one who believed in him when no one else did. Together, they had weathered countless storms. Financial struggles, career setbacks, sleepless nights with newborns, and come out stronger every time. James glanced at the family photo hanging on the wall. It was taken last Christmas, everyone bundled up in matching sweaters, grinning despite the snowstorm that had almost ruined their plans. He remembered Lily insisting on the photo, saying, "One day, we'll look back on this and laugh." He wasn't laughing now. The signs had been subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Lily had started coming home later, blaming late-night meetings or traffic. Her wardrobe began to change. Sleek dresses, expensive heels, and a new perfume that clung to the air long after she left a room. James had chalked it up to her growing career. She had worked hard to rise through the ranks at Brandon's company, and he was proud of her success. But then there were the conversations, shorter, more distant. She no longer laughed at his jokes or asked about his day. Their once intimate evenings had turned into silent nights, with her scrolling through her phone as he sat across from her, nursing a beer and the feeling that something was slipping away. He had tried to dismiss his unease. They were just going through a rough patch, he told himself. Every couple did. But the excuses began to pile up like bricks, building a wall between them. And now, with the images from the ferry burned into his memory, the truth was impossible to ignore. James's thoughts drifted back to a moment 2 weeks earlier. Lily had come home late, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. He had asked how her day was, and she had hesitated before answering. It was a small pause, one that most people wouldn't notice, but James did. "It was fine," she had said, avoiding his gaze. "Just another long meeting." Later that night, as she showered, he had found her phone buzzing on the counter. A message preview flashed on the screen. "Can't wait for tomorrow. B." James's stomach had twisted, but he hadn't opened it. He didn't need to. The initials alone told him enough. James was no stranger to hard work. His small construction business had started as a one-man operation. Just him and a beat-up truck with a ladder strapped to the roof. Over the years, he had built it into a thriving company, earning a reputation for honesty and quality work. It wasn't glamorous, but it provided for his family and gave him a sense of pride. Every nail he hammered, every wall he built, was for them. For Lily, for Max and Emily. They were his world. And now, the thought of that world crumbling was almost too much to bear. But James wasn't the type to crumble under pressure. He had faced challenges before, and he would face this one too. He didn't know exactly how he would fight back, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Brandon or Lily destroy what he had worked so hard to build. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie. Emily bounded into the kitchen, her hair a tangled mess and her face still sleepy. "Dad, can I have chocolate chips in my pancakes?" she asked, her voice full of innocence. James forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Anything for you." As he turned back to the stove, the weight of the betrayal pressed down on him once more. But this time, it wasn't just sadness he felt. It was resolve. He would protect his children, no matter what. He would show them that strength wasn't about avoiding pain but rising above it. "This isn't over," he thought as he flipped a pancake. Not by a long shot. The envelope was ordinary. A thin slip of white paper tucked inside James's tool bag, alongside invoices and receipts for lumber. It caught his attention only because it was unfamiliar. The name at the top wasn't his. It was Lily's. He slid the paper out carefully, his calloused fingers brushing over the glossy print of the receipt. The words were simple but devastating. "To Brandon, with love, engraved luxury watch. Paid via Lily Andrews' card." James's throat tightened as his eyes traced over the words again, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing. The date on the receipt was last month. Lily had told him she was at a late-night strategy meeting. She'd even come home complaining about the catering, laughing about how she'd survived on coffee and stale croissants. He had believed her. He had no reason not to until now. James's chest burned with anger as he thought about Brandon. He had met the man once at a company dinner. Brandon had been everything James wasn't. Tall, polished, and oozing confidence. His expensive suit fit like it was made for him, and his handshake was firm, almost condescending. "You must be the husband," Brandon had said. his tone laced with faux warmth. "Lily talks about you all the time. You're a lucky man." James had felt uneasy even then, though he'd dismissed it as insecurity. Lily had laughed nervously, brushing Brandon's hand off her shoulder as if she didn't want James to notice. But now he saw it for what it was, a warning sign he had ignored. Brandon was the kind of man who thought he could have everything. His wealth and charm gave him the confidence to take what he wanted, regardless of who got hurt in the process. And Lily had fallen for it. The memory of another encounter surfaced, unbidden. It had been at a company holiday gala, held at a swanky downtown hotel. James had accompanied Lily, proud of her success and happy to support her. The evening had been glamorous, with twinkling lights and champagne flutes glittering in every hand. Brandon had made his entrance late, drawing the room's attention as he strode in like he owned the place. He had approached their table, grinning like a politician. "Lily," Brandon had said, his voice smooth as silk, "you look stunning tonight." James had watched as Lily flushed under Brandon's gaze. She had thanked him, her voice light but tinged with something James couldn't quite place. When Brandon turned his attention to James, it was with the faintest hint of a smirk. "And this must be your husband," Brandon had said, extending his hand. "James, right? I've heard so much about you." James shook his hand. The strength of Brandon's grip meant to assert dominance. The interaction had lasted only seconds, but it had left James with a bitter taste in his mouth. That night, he had tried to bring it up with Lily, but she had brushed him off. "Don't be ridiculous," she had said. "Brandon's like that with everyone. He's just trying to be friendly." Now, as James stared at the receipt in his hand, he knew better. A storm of emotions surged within him. Anger, betrayal, denial. He wanted to believe there was some innocent explanation, but the evidence was clear. Lily had bought a gift for Brandon, an expensive, personal gift, and she had lied to James about where she was. He stood in the garage, staring at the receipt until his vision blurred. His mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Had it started as a flirtation, or was it something deeper? And most importantly, why hadn't he seen it sooner? James clenched his fists, crumpling the receipt in his hand. He felt foolish, like a blind man stumbling through a house on fire. The signs had been there all along. The late nights, the new wardrobe, the growing distance between them. He had ignored them because he trusted her, because he had wanted to believe they were stronger than this. But trust was a fragile thing, and Lily had shattered it. That night, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Lily slept beside him. Her breathing was steady, peaceful, as if nothing in the world was wrong. He turned his head slightly, watching the faint glow of her phone screen on the nightstand. The message was there, still unopened. "Dinner tomorrow?" The sender was saved under a name that meant nothing to James, BW. But he didn't need to read the name to know who it was. As he lay there, a plan began to form in his mind. It wasn't complete and it wasn't rational, but it was something. He wouldn't confront her, not yet. He needed more than a receipt and a gut feeling. He needed proof. And when he had it, he would use it to destroy everything Brandon and Lily had built behind his back. James turned away from her, his jaw set. The war had begun, and James was ready to fight. The light from Lily's phone cast a faint glow across the nightstand. James's eyes remained fixed on it, his mind churning with questions. Dinner tomorrow? The message replayed in his thoughts like a broken record. It wasn't just a single text or a fleeting suspicion now. It was a pattern, a web of lies carefully spun over weeks, maybe months. But tonight wasn't the night for confrontation. It was a night for clarity, for uncovering the whole truth. Quietly, James slipped out of bed and into the hallway. He needed air, space to think. His thoughts were heavy, but his resolve was firm. The next morning, James waited until Lily left for work. She kissed him on the cheek as always, her smile practiced but hollow. "Don't forget Max's soccer practice tonight," she reminded him, her tone casual. He nodded, hiding the storm brewing inside. The moment her car disappeared down the street, he sprang into action. He had seen enough movies to know where to start. With a deep breath, he opened her laptop, which was still on the kitchen counter, and began searching. Emails, calendar entries, credit card statements. Each click brought him closer to the answers he feared. Then he found them. A string of emails from Brandon, each one more damning than the last. Dinner reservations at exclusive restaurants. Flight confirmations for 2. And finally, a note that chilled him to the bone. Looking forward to our next ferry ride. Last time was unforgettable. James's stomach churned. He scrolled further, his hands trembling. Attached to one email was a photo. Lily and Brandon on the deck of a ferry, her head resting on his shoulder. The timestamp matched the night she had told him she was working late. That afternoon, James drove to the ferry terminal. It was a hunch, but one he couldn't ignore. He parked his truck near the docks and waited, his eyes scanning the bustling crowd for Lily or Brandon. 2 hours passed, but his patience paid off. From his spot near the terminal's entrance, he saw them. Lily, dressed in the sleek dress he'd complimented just days ago, walked alongside Brandon, who carried a small leather bag. They looked like any couple, casual and comfortable, as they boarded the ferry. James followed at a distance, his heart pounding. He bought a ticket for the same route, keeping to the shadows as he watched them settle into a private cabin. Pulling out his phone, he began recording. Through the glass-paneled cabin, he captured every detail. The way Brandon touched Lily's hand, the way she laughed at his every word. The ferry ride that had once been their family's favorite escape was now a stage for betrayal. That evening, James sat alone in their quiet living room. The house was dark, save for the dim light of his phone screen as he replayed the footage he had taken. He watched Lily lean into Brandon, her smile radiant and carefree. He saw the man who had taken everything from him, his trust, his family, his sense of security. He set the phone down, his hands shaking. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about the life they had built together, the sacrifices he had made, and the years he couldn't get back. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible, but beneath the pain, a fire was growing. He wasn't going to let them win. James leaned back, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The house was silent, but his thoughts were loud. Every memory, every argument, every sign he had ignored replayed in his mind. But now the fog of denial was gone. All that remained was clarity and a quiet, unshakable resolve. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and James was determined to fit them together. He didn't just want the truth, he needed it. And once he had it, he would make sure Brandon and Lily paid for every lie, every betrayal, every moment they had stolen from him. James reached for his phone, scrolling through the photos and videos he had taken. The evidence was undeniable, and it was just the beginning. The war he had declared on the ferry wasn't over. It was only starting. The ferry glided over the water under a dim gray sky, the once vibrant sunset replaced by a foreboding overcast. James stood near the upper deck, his breath steady but his heart racing as he watched Lily and Brandon enter the private cabin below. This time, he wasn't hiding in the shadows, he was ready. Lily's laugh carried faintly through the glass-paneled walls. She looked radiant, her face glowing in a way James hadn't seen in months. Brandon leaned closer, whispering something that made her giggle, his hand brushing hers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. James's fingers tightened around the handle of the cabin door. He pushed it open slowly, stepping into the room with deliberate, measured steps. The sudden intrusion startled them both. Lily's eyes widened, her hand pulling away from Brandon's instinctively. Brandon turned to face James, his smirk returning quickly as if he had nothing to fear. "James?" Lily's voice was shaky, her tone caught between confusion and guilt. "What are you doing here?" James's gaze moved between the two of them, his face calm but his eyes burning with restrained fury. He took a step closer, pulling his phone from his pocket and holding it up. "I could ask you the same thing," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I think I already know." Lily's cheeks flushed, and she glanced at Brandon, who leaned back in his chair with an air of unbothered arrogance. "I'm guessing this is the part where I'm supposed to feel threatened." Brandon said, his tone dripping with condescension. But let's be honest, James. You're out of your depth here. James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You think this is about me trying to intimidate you? He stepped closer, locking eyes with Brandon. This isn't a threat, Brandon. It's a warning. Lily stood, her voice trembling as she spoke. James, please. This isn't what it looks like. Don't, James interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the air. Don't insult me by pretending this is something it's not. I've seen the emails, the photos, the receipts, every lie you've told me, every moment you've stolen from me. It's all right here. He gestured to his phone. Lily's lips parted, but no words came. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as she stared at the floor. Brandon chuckled, shaking his head. You really went through all that trouble? For what? To catch her on a date? Face it, James, you've already lost. James's gaze hardened as he turned to Brandon. Lost? You think this is a game you've won because you're sitting here with my wife? Let me make one thing clear. You might have her now, but this will cost you everything. James stepped back, his voice calm but resolute. Enjoy this little moment while it lasts, Brandon. Because when I'm done with you, there won't be a boardroom left for you to gloat in. And as for you, Lily... His voice softened, but the pain in his tone was unmistakable. I hope he was worth it, because this is the last time you'll ever see me look at you with anything but contempt. Without waiting for a response, James turned on his heel and walked out of the cabin. The sound of his footsteps echoed as he climbed the stairs to the upper deck, leaving Lily and Brandon in stunned silence. As the ferry docked, James stood at the railing, his face unreadable as he stared out at the water. He didn't look back. The confrontation was over, but the war was just beginning. The world outside James's office window moved on as if nothing had happened. Cars buzzed along the streets, neighbors walked their dogs, and the hum of life continued uninterrupted. But for James, everything had changed. The confrontation on the ferry had been a release, but not a resolution. Now it was time to plan his next move. James sat at his desk, a notebook open before him. Pages of scribbled notes, timestamps, and details of Brandon's interactions with Lily spread out across the table. Each entry was another brick in the wall he was building against them. His phone buzzed with notifications, emails, messages, and confirmations. The pieces of his revenge were slowly falling into place. James knew Brandon's confidence wasn't just rooted in his charm. It was in his money, his power, and the sway he held over others. To truly dismantle Brandon, James needed to expose the foundation of his empire. He started with contacts from his construction business, a network of contractors, suppliers, and even former clients. Many had dealings with Brandon's company, and it didn't take long for James to hear whispers of shady practices. Late payments, under-the-table deals, and environmental violations. The more he dug, the clearer it became that Brandon wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. James documented everything meticulously. Emails and invoices, contractor testimonies, even photographs of improperly disposed waste from one of Brandon's development projects. He backed up the data across multiple devices, ensuring nothing could be lost. James's next step was to find someone who could amplify his findings. He thought of an old friend, Rachel Pierce, an investigative journalist who had made her name exposing corporate corruption. She had a knack for uncovering the truth, and her reputation for integrity made her the perfect ally. He called her that afternoon, hesitating only briefly before explaining the situation. I need your help, he said, his voice steady. I've got evidence, real, damning evidence, on a CEO who thinks he's untouchable. But I need someone to connect the dots. Rachel didn't hesitate. Send me everything you've got, she said. If what you're saying checks out, I'll make sure the world knows. While Rachel began her investigation, James turned his focus to his own future. He met with a divorce attorney recommended by a trusted friend. Together, they crafted a strategy that would protect his business, his finances, and most importantly, his children. James provided his attorney with the evidence he had collected against Lily, emails, texts, and photographs. "I don't want this to get ugly," he said, "but I need to make sure Max and Emily stay with me. They're my priority." The attorney nodded. "We'll make a case that highlights her behavior and your stability as a parent. With what you've shown me, we've got a strong foundation." James stood in his workshop late one night, staring at the photos of Brandon's developments pinned to the corkboard. He could see the cracks forming in Brandon's world, small now, but widening with every step he took. As he pieced together his strategy, James couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Brandon's arrogance had hurt more people than just James, and exposing him would be a victory for everyone who had suffered under his greed. James leaned back in his chair, the weight of his plans pressing on him but also giving him purpose. He glanced at a picture of Max and Emily on his desk, their smiles a reminder of why he was doing this. "They'll see who you really are, Brandon," he muttered, "and Lily will understand the cost of betrayal." He closed his laptop, the blue glow of the screen fading into darkness. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the hum of mingling voices, clinking glasses, and the muted strains of a string quartet. The annual corporate gala was Brandon's domain, a stage where he flaunted his power, wealth, and charm. Tonight, he stood at the center of it all, basking in the glow of admiration. But in the shadows, James watched, calm yet electric with purpose. This was the night Brandon's empire would crumble. 2 weeks before the gala, James had handed Rachel the last piece of the puzzle, a file containing years' worth of financial misconduct, environmental violations, and fraudulent transactions tied directly to Brandon's company. Rachel's investigation had culminated in an explosive exposé published just hours before the event. The headline screamed across every major news outlet: "The Untouchable CEO, Fraud, Corruption, and Cover UPS in Brandon Worthington's Empire." Within minutes, social media lit up, and the stock of Brandon's company began to nosedive. Investors pulled out, employees panicked, and the board of directors scrambled for damage control. But Brandon, unaware of the article's publication, continued with the gala as planned. Brandon strode onto the stage, microphone in hand, his trademark smirk firmly in place. The room quieted, all eyes on him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and confident, "tonight, we celebrate innovation, success, and the future we're building together." In the crowd, James stood near the back, dressed in an unassuming suit, his phone connected to the projector system. He glanced at Rachel, who nodded subtly from across the room. It was time. Brandon continued, oblivious. "This company has always stood for integrity." The lights dimmed abruptly, cutting him off. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. On the massive screen behind him, a slideshow began to play. Bank statements showing illicit transfers, emails detailing cover-ups, and photographs of Brandon shaking hands with known criminals. Gasps and whispers filled the ballroom as each slide revealed more damning evidence. Then came the final image. Brandon and Lily on the ferry, her head on his shoulder, time-stamped and undeniable. The room erupted. Brandon turned toward the screen, his face pale. He spun back to the audience, stammering, This is a mistake, an attack, an attempt to discredit me." James stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "It's not a mistake, Brandon. It's the truth. The only thing surprising here is how long it took for everyone to see who you really are." Brandon's eyes narrowed, his bravado crumbling. "You think you've won, James? You're just a bitter, small man who had everything you thought you could take without consequence," James interrupted. "But I'm not the only one you've hurt. This isn't just personal. It's justice." In the crowd, Lily stood frozen, her face pale as the damning photos looped on the screen. Her friends, once envious of her seemingly perfect life, whispered behind their hands, casting her judgmental glances. When the images of her and Brandon appeared, someone muttered loudly, "Homewrecker." Lily's composure broke, tears streaming down her face as she fled the room. The next morning, Lily received divorce papers. The evidence James had meticulously gathered ensured she would leave the marriage with nothing but memories. Custody of Max and Emily was secured for James, his case bolstered by her infidelity and neglect. James's lawyer called with the news. "It's done," she signed. "You're free." As James walked Max to soccer practice a week later, he felt lighter, as though a weight he'd carried for months had finally been lifted. Max looked up at him, his face bright with a question about the game, unaware of the battles his father had fought to protect him and Emily. James smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "Go get champ." From the sidelines, he watched his son play, knowing the war was over. Brandon's empire lay in ruins, Lily's betrayal was exposed, and James had reclaimed his life. The aftermath of James's meticulously orchestrated revenge rippled far beyond Brandon's empire and Lily's reputation. It seeped into the lives of those James loved most, the unintended casualties of his fight for justice. On a chilly Monday morning, James dropped Max and Emily off at school. Their usual cheerful chatter was subdued. Max, normally excited to discuss his favorite soccer plays, remained silent, gripping his backpack tightly. Emily's eyes darted nervously around the playground. "Everything okay, guys?" James asked, sensing their unease. Max hesitated before mumbling, "Some kids. They keep saying stuff about you and Mom." Emily's voice trembled as she added, "They called you a hero, but they said Mom's a bad person." James's heart sank. The public nature of the scandal had turned their lives into fodder for gossip. The children were bearing the brunt of whispers and taunts, their innocence overshadowed by events they didn't fully understand. "I'm sorry," James said softly, kneeling to their level. "None of this is your fault. I promise I'll fix it." Max nodded, his expression conflicted. Emily hugged her father tightly before following her brother into the school building. James watched them go, a heavy wave of guilt settling over him. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, James sat alone in the dimly lit living room. The evidence of his victory, newspaper clippings, saved screenshots of Brandon's downfall, felt hollow. The cost of his revenge loomed large, the emotional toll on his children cutting deeper than any of Lily's betrayals. He stared at the family photo still hanging on the wall, their smiling faces a stark reminder of what once was. He hadn't taken it down, though he often considered it. It wasn't the past he missed. It was the peace they had once shared. "Was it worth it?" he muttered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. The answer wasn't simple. Brandon's corruption was exposed, Lily's lies uncovered, and justice served. But the collateral damage, his children's struggles, the weight of the public eye on his family, made him question his methods. He had sought revenge to protect his children, yet now they were suffering because of it. One night, James stood in the doorway of Max's room, watching him sleep. The boy's face was peaceful, a stark contrast to the burden he carried during the day. Emily's soft snores came from the room next door, her stuffed animal clutched tightly in her arms. James realized that while he had fought to dismantle the forces that threatened his family, he had overlooked the need to rebuild what truly mattered, their sense of security and happiness. He retreated to the kitchen and opened his notebook, the same one he had used to plan his revenge. On a fresh page, he wrote a new heading, Family First. Beneath it, he listed ideas for rebuilding their lives, therapy for the children, a fresh start in a new town, and time away from the chaos to heal as a family. "I can't undo what's been done," he whispered, "but I can make things better." The following weekend, James took Max and Emily to the countryside, leaving the noise and scrutiny of the city behind. They spent the day hiking through autumn-colored trails, skipping stones across a glistening lake, and roasting marshmallows by a fire. Laughter filled the air, tentative at first, then wholehearted. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, James sat with his children, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. Emily leaned against his shoulder, and Max poked at the fire with a stick. "Thanks for bringing us here, Dad," Max said softly. "It feels normal again." James smiled, his heart swelling with both pride and a renewed sense of purpose. "Normal is what we're going to work on, together." For the first time in months, James felt hope. The fight for revenge had ended, but a new journey had begun. A journey of healing, growth, and rediscovery. The courtroom was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a distant clock. Brandon Worthington, once the epitome of corporate invincibility, sat slumped at the defendant's table. The sharp lines of his tailored suit seemed to mock his disheveled appearance. Dark circles under his eyes, his once confident smirk now replaced by a hollow stare. James watched from the gallery, his expression impassive. Months of investigation, public outrage, and mounting legal cases had culminated in this moment. The prosecutor stood, presenting the final evidence. Fraudulent financial records, environmental violations, and testimonies from whistleblowers emboldened by Brandon's fall from grace. When the gavel fell, sentencing Brandon to years of imprisonment and financial ruin, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Brandon's assets would be liquidated to pay fines and restitution to those he had wronged. The mighty CEO had been reduced to a cautionary tale. His empire crumbled beyond repair. Later, in a private holding area, Brandon requested to speak with James. Against his better judgment, James agreed, curious about what the man who had tried to destroy his life would say. Brandon sat behind a plexiglass divider, his arrogance replaced by desperation. "James," he began, his voice trembling, "you've made your point. You've taken everything from me. But this doesn't have to go any further." James leaned forward, his eyes cold and unwavering. "You thought you won," he said quietly, his words deliberate. "But you never even saw the game." Brandon opened his mouth to protest, but James stood, cutting him off. "You played with people's lives, Brandon. You took what wasn't yours and thought there'd be no consequences. Well, now you get to live with them." Without another word, James turned and walked away, leaving Brandon to face his fate alone. The morning sun streamed through the windows of James's new home, a modest but cozy house far from the city that had been the backdrop of so much pain. The doorbell rang, breaking the peaceful silence. When James opened the door, he found Lily standing there, her face pale and tear-streaked. "James?" she began, her voice trembling. "Can we talk?" He stepped aside, allowing her in. She hesitated before entering, her eyes scanning the space. It was warm and inviting, filled with photos of Max and Emily, their laughter captured in candid moments. "I'm sorry," Lily said, her voice breaking. "I made a terrible mistake. I let my ambition, my weakness destroy everything we built. But I want to fix it. For us, for the kids." James crossed his arms, his face unreadable. "Fix it?" he echoed, his tone neutral. "You think after everything, we can just go back to how things were?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I know we can't, but I want to try. I'll do whatever it takes." James took a deep breath, his eyes softening but his resolve firm. "Lily, I loved you. I built my life around you, trusted you, and you destroyed that trust. Not just for me, but for Max and Emily." Her sobs grew louder, but he continued. "They deserve better. I deserve better. You made your choices, and I've made mine. Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't shut me out completely." James shook his head. "I'm not shutting you out. You'll always be their mother. But as for us, there is no us anymore." Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, defeated. "I understand." He walked her to the door, watching as she left, her figure shrinking in the distance. As the door clicked shut, James felt a wave of clarity wash over him. For the first time, he truly felt free. That evening, James sat with Max and Emily on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Emily leaned against his side, her laughter light and carefree as she recounted a story from school. Max was busy sketching plays for his soccer team, his confidence restored. James looked at his children, their resilience a testament to the strength they had found together. The battle had been long, painful, and costly, but it was over. Justice had been served, and a brighter future lay ahead. "You okay, Dad?" Max asked, glancing up from his notebook. James smiled, ruffling his son's hair. Yeah, buddy. I'm better than okay. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The wounds of betrayal had scarred over, but they no longer defined him. He had reclaimed his life, not through vengeance, but through the love and strength of his family. And for James, that was the ultimate victory. The ferry cut through the still waters, its engine humming softly beneath the pre-dawn sky. James leaned on the railing of the upper deck, the cold metal pressing against his forearms. The horizon was painted in hues of soft lavender and gold, the promise of sunrise peeking through the scattered clouds. This was the same ferry that had once carried the weight of his despair. Now it felt different, a place of reflection, not pain. James inhaled deeply, the salty air filling his lungs and clearing his thoughts. He wasn't the man who had stood here months ago, torn apart by betrayal. He was someone new, someone stronger. His life had transformed in the wake of the storm. The house he shared with Max and Emily was no longer haunted by the memories of what was lost. Instead, it brimmed with laughter, late-night board games, and the steady hum of a life rebuilt. The kids were thriving, their confidence returning as the echoes of gossip faded. Max had become the star player on his soccer team, while Emily's drawings filled every corner of their home. James had poured his energy into his construction business, expanding it into new ventures. The projects were more than work. They were a testament to his resilience. Every nail hammered, every blueprint finalized felt like a declaration. I'm still here. James pulled a small notebook from his pocket, its edges worn and pages creased. It was the same one he had used to plan his revenge against Brandon and Lily. But now its purpose had shifted. He flipped to a fresh page, scribbling the words that had been forming in his mind since he boarded the ferry. The fight didn't break me. It revealed who I was meant to be. I thought I'd lost everything, but I gained what truly mattered, myself and my children. He closed the notebook, tucking it away as the first rays of sunlight broke through the horizon. The water glistened like molten gold, the ferry seeming to glide toward a brighter future. James watched the scene unfold, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. He thought he won, James murmured, his voice steady. But in losing them, I gained everything I needed. As the ferry approached the dock, James straightened, his shoulders squared and his step sure. The sunrise wasn't just the beginning of a new day. It was a symbol of his new life, one built on strength, love, and the unshakable resolve to move forward.